morning. I'm going to go right to Canvas and um, open up the Intro to Shutter Speed assignment, which is 2.5-3. So today we're going to go over these photo concepts because next week in class, you guys are going to take some photos using the DSLRs that capture what we're about to see in this. And I understand there are a couple of people who are working with this kind of thing in their capstone as well, so this is good timing for people this week. So shutter speed is a concept that's unique to photography. It's one of the manual settings we'll work with in this class, and this visual lays out the different things that contribute towards making a photograph in a camera. And so on a phone camera, unless you have an app, you don't control any of this. The phone does it all for you. But on a manual or a DSLR camera, you can control all of these things individually, or you can control them all at once. So the shutter speed relates to movement, and that's what we're going to get into this week. Next week, or in the future sometime soon, we'll do aperture, which is focus. So for those of you doing depth of field, that's going to help you out. ISO sensitivity is something that you can change regardless of whether you're working with aperture or shutter speed. And then exposure compensation is one more thing that helps you control how bright or how dark your photos are. So when you take a picture, you control how much light enters the camera. If you let too much light in, you can overexpose the image. And if you don't let enough light in, you can underexpose your image. So when you're doing this on a phone, if you tap the screen on your phone, you get a little box, a little yellow box with a little sun next to it. And you can drag that sun up or down to make your images darker or lighter. So shutter speed, the definition of shutter speed is how you control the length of time that light enters your camera. So when you take a photograph, your camera's shutter speed opens, letting light in. It stays open for a period of time, usually just a fraction of a second, and then it closes. So that's what's called the shutter speed. Shutter priority is a setting on the dial on the top of most DSLRs, and it's often represented by an S or a TV. And it's really funny because TV has nothing to do with television in this case. So if you want to play with shutter speed and you have your own DSLR, you would set it on the S. And then there's usually a dial that you will use to move around to get one of these fractions. So a 1/500 means it's 1/500th of a second, which is really fast. The little one with the little quotation marks next to it means 1 second, which is a long time for a shutter to be open. So shutter speed controls the length of time that light enters your camera. So this is a neat little video that actually shows you the inside of a shutter in a camera and sort of explains how it works.
Hello there. Now you may be wondering, what is so fast about a camera? Well, I'll show you. When you take a picture with a regular viewfinder camera, you're not actually looking down the same lens that's taking the picture. You're looking down a separate viewfinder lens. And in some situations, that gives you a slight difference in perspective because it's only an approximation of what your picture is going to be. Now, a way around that is by using an SLR camera, which stands for single lens reflex. And that's pretty much exactly what it is. There's only one lens. There's no separate viewfinder lens. Now, that requires a little bit of cleverness behind the lens. There's actually a mirror placed at 45 degrees that blocks the sensor, which means you can look through the viewfinder down and through the exact lens that's going to take the picture. So that leads us on to the very fast part. When you take a picture, you'll hear this sound. Didn't sound like much, but actually quite a lot just happened there. And you'll notice that in the viewfinder, your vision was blocked for a very split second. So the only way we're going to see what actually happens is by taking off the lens, zooming the phantom in and filming this at a ridiculously high frame rate. We'll start with a 30th of a second. Now you're looking at the mirror, which is in front of the shutter. When I press down the button, the mirror flips up out of the way and temporarily blocks the viewfinder. Then the shutter comes down, whoosh, now light is exposing on the sensor, and then the shutter closes again, followed by the mirror coming back down so you can see through the viewfinder again. As you can see from that clip, this camera has a mechanical shutter that moves out of the way and allows light to hit the sensor. A very fundamental part of photography is the duration of your exposure has very different effects on the image, and you can control that with the shutter speed. For example, a relatively long exposure of say 2 seconds would give you a bright image, but anything that moved within those 2 seconds would have a trail of motion blur behind it. So not ideal for filming a fast-moving subject. For a very fast-moving subject, you would want a much shorter shutter duration. The fastest this camera will do it is an 8,000th of a second, which looks like this. So now what we'll do is we'll use the phantom to film different shutter speeds of the camera and see how they all compare to each other in slow motion. Honestly, these are probably going to look identical in real time, but we'll definitely be able to see the difference in slow-mo. So we'll start with a 500th of a second. One thousandth of a second. A 2,000th of a second. Four thousandth of a second. And an 8,000th of a second. Let's have a look at the 4 fastest ones side by side just to see the comparison. This kind of stuff is fascinating to me. It makes me wonder how many people take for granted what's happening inside their camera when they take a picture. The fact that the shutter is made of 2 clusters of metal blades that at their shortest duration are moving right next to each other, allowing just the smallest slit of light to hit the sensor. This is also a great visual representation of why you need so much light for a high shutter speed shot, because the amount of time the light is hitting the sensor is so short, you end up with a much darker image. There are many types of shutter that...
So I love the slow motion sound that you get when he's doing that. Okay, so that is a sort of a visual representation of what shutter speed is. So the question then is, why do I need to know this? How is this going to be helpful to me? So it's like a timer. I mentioned before that when you see the one with the little 2 quotation marks next to it, that means 2 seconds. So here's how you're going to apply this in the classroom. Motion blur is like in this photograph when you see the trails of something in motion. And so you would set your shutter priority on the camera and then choose a slow shutter speed. So 1-60, that is basically where you start to get to see motion blur, and you go down in numbers from there. The cool thing about this photograph is that this gentleman sitting there on the stool is perfectly in focus, and the only thing that blurs is the movement around him. So that's a challenge. So generally speaking, you end up using a tripod, or you have to rest your camera or your phone on something so that you don't get what's called a camera shake, where the background gets all blurry too. So this is a neat little visualization of the differences between the the times. This is a pinwheel at 1 second, and everything is so blurred that you can barely see the different colors. This is 1/4 of a second, 1/15 of a second, and so on. And so you can see at 1/60th of a second, things start to look a little blurry. 1/60th of a second is still capturing it with frozen in time. So you use motion blur to get photos like this, which are really cool. I think we've probably all at one point or another seen these waterfalls that look like the water is sort of a smooth ribbon. You can show the passage of time, like this photograph where people are sort of moving around and you see your shadows. And then these night shots, if you have a camera that you can set up on a tripod and have the shutter open, in this case, it was probably a couple of hours, you actually see the stars travel around the sky as the Earth rotates. So, really cool stuff. Um, Again, when you're shooting on slow shutter speeds, you want to make sure your camera doesn't move because that detracts from the blur of the object you want to see moving, and that's the camera shake. So we'll work in class on a couple of ways of preventing that from happening. This is a photograph taken in Bangkok using just the light that was available from this industrial setting. It reminds me a lot of where you pick up and drop off at the airports, like in places like Boston, and you see all of the light trails from the cars. But you notice how everything else is in sharp focus. So when would you like to show motion blur? And is it fast or slow shutter speed? We show motion blur when you want to create the effects of light trailing or you want to see something moving. And it is a slow shutter speed because remember, you have to have the shutter open for a long period of time to capture that kind of thing. So the opposite is stop motion. So stop motion freezes things immediately, even in like fast, violent motion, like with this explosion. So on a phone, you generally get stop motion with almost every photograph you take. It's really hard not to get stop motion because the cameras are so sensitive and they capture everything so quickly. So on a DSLR, you would again set it on S or TV for shutter priority. And you would start with your shutter speeds of 1/25th or higher. And so to stop motion, you get really cool things like this. You can capture very fast moving subjects like a leopard or a race car or children. A fast shutter speed is really helpful capturing children who run around a lot. This is a really wonderful picture showing a bubble as it's bursting. And, things like splashes. So these are the speeds that will help you with a DSLR freeze motion for various things. Like auto racing, you really have a really fast shutter speed. So the bigger the number, the faster it is. And a person walking is fine at about 125 or 250. So when would you want to stop motion? And is it a fast or a slow shutter speed? You want to stop motion when you want to freeze something to see it clearly if it's moving very quickly. And it's a very fast shutter speed. So it's kind of a good way to remember it is the faster your subject is moving, the faster your shutter speed would be to capture it and freeze it. So this is a neat little thing. There's a link on here for all of you to try. That will show you how shutter speed affects it. And there's something really neat I want you to notice at the same time. So our ISO down at the bottom is set at 1600, and that is sort of a middle of the road ISO. And ISO is how sensitive your camera is to light. So we're going to leave it there for a second. And the shutter speed is set at 1/60th. And the aperture is at 8. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to set it on shutter priority so that the only thing I can change is this. So this simulates what happens in your camera. And I'm going to take a picture. Click. Now this is showing me what it would look like. You don't see the propeller moving because 1/60th allows it to blur. So if I go up to this other setting, the 4,000th, and take the picture, it freezes, it stop motions the propeller completely. So that's kind of a neat thing to show you. You notice as I slide this down, it shows over here what you're getting, and then there's a place to click more. So at some point, I recommend you go to this little site. There are other pictures that you can select. I'm not sure why it's not clicking on it. That allow you to see what it would look like with a portrait or other things. It's not just that one. And so that's the end of our slideshow. So I realize that this is probably a little sort of technical for us to be getting into right now because you haven't especially done much work with the DSLRs. But we'll go over it again when Monday and Tuesday. I just wanted you to have it sort of in the back of your mind that you stop motion with a fast shutter speed and you can get blur with a slow one. And we have an experiment all set up for you. You guys are going to take 4 photos of each. And I'm going to bring some things like some pinwheels. I'm going to look for a jump rope. I might borrow one from the gym classes or something like that. And you're going to either work by yourself or work in teams with the digital single lens reflex cameras. And so we'll have a little primer on how those work. And hopefully you'll get to take all of your photos in class, and then for homework next week, you're going to just upload them and put them in a slideshow. So any questions off the bat about all of that stuff? I don't want you to feel like you have to remember all of those times and things. We'll have it all typed out and ready for you to go. Any questions?
I was just wondering what the plan is for us.
So that's a good question. If you have a DSLR, then you can do the same things that we're doing in class. And what I'll try to do is record class. Like this week, I recorded the beginning of class where I was going through the projects and explaining things. And I've posted that on this week's agenda so that you can sort of have that in-class experience if that's helpful. If you don't have a DSLR, then there are apps that will allow you to control these settings on your phone. So you'll basically do the same thing using a phone camera, and you'll set them to the different settings that we're using in class. Hopefully, like there's a couple of things you can do for the slow shutter speeds. You can run some water, like in a kitchen sink, and take photos of that. For really fast ones, that would be a little more challenging. It would work if you like had a fan that you could set a scarf up or something in front of it, or you could go outside and watch cars go by on the road. If you have siblings and they're willing to run around and jump and do silly things like that, if they can get fast enough, then you can use that for stop motion. And generally speaking, I think you would need to download an app. There's one called Focos, Focos, I believe, that allows you to turn a phone camera into manual settings. And so there are different ones for Androids and iPhones, and there are free ones, so you shouldn't have to pay for anything like that. Does that help? Okay. And please reach out to me if you try it and it looks weird. Generally, in the past, people have like uploaded the slideshows, and I've had a couple of questions, that kind of thing. Any other questions? Okay, so if I could have Ashley and Isabella hang on just for a sec. I have a couple of questions for you, and then everybody else can head out and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.